Hey, everybody. Welcome to the best in true crime podcasting. This is True Crime Tuesday, and we've got a great interview lined up for you today. Now, I want to make a mention. You'll get the entire interview. The only segment of today's show you won't hear is our Dumb Crimes, Stupid Criminals. Why? Because that's under Stitcher Premium. We want to make sure that everybody gets a chance to hear these remarkable interviews of these incredible true crime stories. But for only $5 a month, you can subscribe to Stitcher Premium. That'll give you the entire episode. That includes the entire interview you're about to hear, plus Dumb Crimes, Stupid Criminals, and every episode of Darkness Radio, the best in paranormal podcasting. All 1,000+ episodes commercial free. And if that's still not enough reason for you to want to subscribe, you don't just get True Crime Tuesday and Darkness Radio, which, let's face it, for $5 a month, that's pretty valuable. You get every other show underneath the Stitcher umbrella. That means hundreds of thousands of hours of your favorite type of podcast programming commercial free. Nobody got time for commercials. So if you're interested, then make sure you go subscribe now to Stitcher Premium. Use code word Darkness Radio, all one word, Darkness Radio, for some deep discounts for an entire year's savings. Go do that right now. Take advantage of the special and be able to listen to Darkness Radio, True Crime Tuesday, and all of the other amazing programs across Stitcher's platform. Go subscribe right now. Sit back, relax, and enjoy this episode of True Crime Tuesday. Hello and welcome. You're tuned into the best in true crime talk radio. This is True Crime Tuesday. I'm your host, Dave Schrader. Along with me, the one, the only, and the incomparable Mr. Tim Dennis. Hello, Tim.
Hello there.
Strange announcement to make on this. You and I are heading off to Michigan for the big para-conference that's taking place this week. We will not be doing a live video stream this Thursday night. We're doing it tonight. So if you follow Darkness Radio on YouTube or any of our social media pages, the live video stream will be tonight. And with Cameron Pasha, we'll be talking with him tonight. And then the audio will be made available as part of our podcast programming on Friday for those of you that listen to Darkness Radio. So I just want to let you know about that. This is the only chance we get to announce this. We had to shuffle dates around in order to accommodate our guest. I just wanted to make sure if you do want to watch the live video stream, it is tonight. Go find our Darkness Radio YouTube channel or follow us along on social media and you'll see the live stream links there. Today, Tim, we're going to take an interesting look in true crime to forensics, the science behind the deaths of famous people. Our guest today is Dr. Harry Milman. He is a consulting pharmacologist, toxicologist, and expert witness with over 40 years of experience at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the U.S. National Cancer Institute, and the National Institute of Health, and the U.S. Public Health Service. Dr. Milman assisted in over 300 civil, criminal, and high-profile legal cases and has testified at trials and depositions. He has a new book out, Forensics, the Science Behind the Deaths of Famous People. And we have a link for that book and to his website on today's program guide so you can find it easily enough. Dr. Milman, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I appreciate it.
I'm curious, in discussing the idea of being an expert witness, can you give for our listeners a little bit of an explanation of exactly what goes into being an expert witness? And are expert witnesses hired to do these depositions and court initiations? How all does that work?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked me that question because I get that often. People ask me, how do I become an expert witness? And I always tell them the first thing you have to do is become an expert, and then you can be an expert witness. And what does that mean? Well, in my case, I have a PhD in pharmacology, and I have lots of experience both in toxicology and cancer. And about 20 years ago or so, I was invited to testify in a trial, and I liked the experience, and I set up my expert witness website, and then I got picked up by attorneys all over the country for the last 20 some odd years, and I've testified. I've assisted in over 300 cases, and basically what that means is, there's a slight difference between civil and litigation cases, but in my case, I testify in both, but 90% of the cases tend to be civil and about 10%, 15% are criminal cases. And basically what it means is that one, as an expert witness, there's a process. So, for example, just to give you your listeners an idea, I get picked up by attorneys all over the country based on my website, and they're looking for a toxicologist. So, for example, let's say a simple case, driving while intoxicated. Well, what that means is that somebody's being held by the police for, and let's say somebody got killed in the accident. So now they're being held by the police, and the police in turn is trying to show that the driver, who they claim was intoxicated, caused the death because he was impaired by, for example, the alcohol or drugs. In order to do that, they have to have an expert, somebody like me, and also the other side, the defendant has to have an expert to show that in fact the individual was intoxicated. He had alcohol in his system, and the amount of alcohol was in the range that can cause him to lose control of the vehicle, not being fall asleep, or some other way being incapacitated, so that eventually the accident occurred, and therefore he was liable for the accident and the death. This is a simple example, but the process, basically, an attorney calls me, asks me if I can assist. I, in turn, review records as well as scientific literature. At some point, maybe I prepare a report. Eventually, I get called to testify in a deposition. And then if the case keeps moving forward, then the next step is the trial, where I testify live in person at a trial, and then there's a verdict. That's pretty much the process. And depending on, if I get called at the very beginning of the process, the whole process can take sometimes as long as 2 years.
Now, is it tough when you're an expert witness? I've got to guess that then puts you into the crosshairs of whether it's the prosecution or the defense, whoever you're speaking against. Do they then go on the attack of you and your personal credentials or anything about you to try to discredit your testimony? And how does that affect your business, your life?
Yeah, and that's, you hit right on the head, because that's exactly what they do. A lot of times, for example, the defense hires me as an expert to testify on behalf of the defense, and the prosecution doesn't have an expert. That's exactly what they do, is they try to belittle my credentials and my opinions. So the first time that happened to me, I was very upset. But then you learn that's just the process. That's exactly what they do. And they try to belittle, for example, in my case, as you indicated earlier, more than 40 years of experience. I have a PhD in pharmacology and lots of toxicology experience. And they might come back and they say, well, you're not a medical doctor, right? How can you say anything about cause of death when you're not a physician? So they try to belittle you that way, or they might say, for example, you never published on alcohol, even though as a toxicologist I know everything there is to know about alcohol, but I've never published on alcohol, which is really not a requirement. But they try to put this doubt into the jury's mind. So, like I said, the first time that happened to me, I was very upset. But you kind of have to learn to have a thick skin and really not worry about it.
Now, you examine celebrity deaths, and I know there's drug and I'm sure self-inflicted deaths and accidents, murder. How different is it in examining a celebrity's case over John Q. Public? Is there quite a bit of difference in the way it has to be handled?
Well, the short answer is no, because when all is said and done, we're all under the same rules and regulations and laws. So that's not an issue. But practically speaking, I always take a case on the assumption that everybody deserves a fair trial and everybody deserves a good defense. Apparently, there's some people out there that maybe don't believe that, and so sometimes when I come home after I testify, I find some nasty emails, or my Facebook page was hacked, or some nasty phone calls, phone messages, people who disagree with me, and then they put these comments, on my Facebook page or my phone. That again, that's a bit upsetting because, like I said, I think everybody deserves a fair defense. Whether you're guilty or you're innocent. Obviously, I don't lie, and I just go within my areas of expertise and in the sciences. So that's the one detriment, if you will, for testifying or looking into celebrities. But aside from that, in terms of the science, everybody is treated exactly the same way. I testify within the information that's available at the time, and then the law takes it from there.
Is there ever an instance, especially when it's surrounding people that are well known, where they try to pay to influence your expert decision of what took place to protect the image? And I'm not saying that you've done it, but has there ever been that, thrown your way to try to get a more favorable outcome for the PR of that celebrity?
No, it certainly didn't happen to me. I've never come across that. Practically speaking, I don't really interact with the celebrities per se. I always work with the attorneys. In fact, just as a general rule, whether it's celebrity or otherwise, I prefer working with the attorney as opposed to working with the individual client, because the individual client is very, very emotional, and their perspective is more emotional, whereas the attorney is more objective. So I prefer working with the attorneys, and certainly with the celebrities, it's always been with the attorneys. And the attorney basically provides me with facts, that is to say, written information. For example, police reports, or if there was a police report, or if it's a medical malpractice issue, I get the medical records. I review the medical records. So all my opinions are based on facts, and those facts could be, like I said, police reports, medical records, autopsy reports, and then supplement that with the scientific information that I review, the scientific literature about what we know about different drugs or different issues or medical conditions. Because in the final analysis, what you want to show is you want to build a scientific story that is plausible and that basically explain what could have happened or likely happened. I shouldn't say could have happened, more likely happened from a scientific point of view. So that is to say, again, the testimony is based on the premise that the evidence, the scientific and all these records that I just mentioned, they all point in one direction, that it's more likely than not that the drug caused, the overdose, or the patient died from an overdose, for example. So what I'm saying is it's more likely than not is a standard, and that means that more than 50% of the evidence has to support your opinion. And the evidence, as I mentioned, is police reports, medical records, autopsies, the circumstances surrounding the incident, as well as the scientific literature. So it's not that you have to have 100% of the information pointing in your direction, because there's always information that you don't have or is never gathered and is missing, but 50% or more than 50% has to support your opinion. So, which therefore leads to more likely than not, as opposed to 50%, which would be as likely as not, or less than 50% would be less likely than not. So you need to support your opinion in the standard is more likely than not, which basically means, as I said, that most of the information, obviously we don't have all the information, but most of the information has to support your opinion.
That's a lot to chew on. I mean, especially when you have to look at these cases objectively. And like you said, I mean, it's in the science, and science doesn't lie, right? It can be misrepresented, misinterpreted, but the science itself doesn't lie. So it's all you can do is give the information, the expert analysis of somebody who's looked into all aspects of alcoholism, drug, use, everything like that, and give the best possible evaluation from what science tells us in these cases.
Precisely right. So I think which leads me to the first concept that I want your listeners to be mindful of, and this is an area where there's always misinterpretation by the public, and that is the concept of cause of death versus manner of death. So cause of death is a biological explanation based on scientific facts, like we just talked about, that explains how the person died. For example, died from an overdose, from a drug overdose, or the alcohol was sedated and caused respiratory depression, or let's say is a gunshot wound, and it was a gunshot wound to the head that in turn affected the brain and then caused death. So cause of death is very scientific explanation, based on scientific facts. There's rarely any dispute about the cause of death. Just to give you an example from my recent book, Natalie Wood. For those of you who are not familiar, Natalie Wood, an actress many years ago, was found drowned in the Pacific Ocean. So the cause of death was drowning. Excuse me. The cause of death was drowning, and but the manner of death, this is where it's subject to interpretation. So manner of death, there are a number of different categories. There's what we call natural death, which is normal death. Somebody died from a heart attack, for example. There's accident. There's homicide, where somebody actually kills you. There's suicide, and when none of these fit, when the incident doesn't fit any one of these four categories, then it would be undetermined. Now, in Natalie Wood's case, to this day, they don't have a good explanation for the manner of death. They know she drowned, so that's the cause of death based on scientific facts, which we can go over if necessary. But the manner of death, some people think her husband, Robert Wagner, pushed her off the boat, and she drowned, and that would be homicide. And some people think that she wound up in the water. It was an accident. So the coroner, the first coroner at the time, he labeled it an accident. It was an accidental drowning. Many years later, the case was reopened. A different coroner examined the same facts, the same information, came up with the conclusion that the manner of death should be changed from accident to undetermined. Undetermined because the bruises that she had displayed, that the body displayed, this coroner said that he had no way to say that they couldn't have happened on the boat as opposed to happening in the water. So if they happened on the boat, that means there was some sort of an altercation that may have led to her death. So he labeled the manner of death undetermined. So what I'm talking about here is that there are two highly regarded, well-respected coroners, the first one and the one who reviewed again, 20 years later, came up with two different conclusions on the manner of death. And the public, of course, there's a lot of conspiracy theories, and this is where they always focus on the manner of death. Nobody ever, or hardly ever, disputes the cause of death, which is a scientific explanation. That tends to be very solid. So in Natalie Wood's case, for example, she died from drowning, and there's scientific evidence to support that. But the manner of death is an illegal interpretation of the event, the circumstances surrounding the event, and as well as the scientific literature, as well as the scientific facts. So there's always discussion about the manner of death, but there's no discussion about cause of death. The public always wants to know, well, it was a homicide. Her husband killed her. Yeah, but they don't support it with facts. And when they don't support it with facts, this is the legal system. The legal system does not convict anybody if there are no facts. So in this case, undetermined.
But do they look at aspects like, okay, we obviously we could tell she drowned, but was it drowning due to just inability to swim, or was there alcohol intoxication, drug? Do we find that there is a bruise that occurred prior to the drowning? Do those aspects weigh in, and how deeply do we examine those? If Robert Wagner, the husband, doesn't want an autopsy, is that a choice he gets to make?
Right. So you hit on several points there. We'll take them one at a time. So first of all, when you asked the question, as you noticed, some of the things you mentioned have to do with cause of death. Some of them have to do with manner of death. So in terms of drowning, let's just take, did she or did she not drown? Well, she did. And the reason we know that is because of, let's say, first of all, they did an autopsy. Now, when is an autopsy done? Let's start with that. Well, normally, if it's not a suspicious death, there's no state requirement for an autopsy to be done. The family may request one, but it's not a requirement. The requirement is under suspicious death, so the family doesn't really have much of a say. It's a suspicious death, potentially a homicide, so the state automatically does an autopsy. Okay, so and when there is an autopsy, let's say on Natalie Wood, well, then they certain things that they find. So when the autopsy itself is an examination of the anatomy, okay, and aside from that, they also do a toxicology testing, and that means they look at blood and urine primarily for presence of drugs, or in this case, alcohol. And they did find some alcohol in the system, and I calculated, based on the amount of alcohol that they found in her blood, as well as the time that between the death and when she was last seen on the boat. Because what happens is when you drink a glass of alcohol, and an hour later, one glass of alcohol has already been excreted from your blood. For every hour, a glass full of alcohol gets excreted from your blood. So on the one hand, you're drinking, and therefore the blood concentration increases. But on the other hand, if you wait, the blood concentration starts decreasing. So you have to kind of calculate and account for these two phenomenon. And make a long story short, I calculated that she had about twice as much alcohol in her system as a driver under the influence, in the United States. So in the United States, a blood alcohol level of 0.08 is the maximum permissible for drivers under the influence of alcohol. And she had about twice as much at the time she was on the boat. So certainly alcohol affected her while she was still on the boat. Okay, so and at that level, alcohol makes you giddy, makes you unsteady on your feet. You don't have good judgment. It's possible for her to have stumbled off the boat, which in turn, if she stumbled off the boat into the water, that would be one reason she wound up in the water. This doesn't mean it's the only reason. It's the only possibility, but that's one possibility. Again, which deals with manner of death as opposed to cause of death. Cause of death, we know she drowned. How do we know she drowned? Well, there's fluid in the lungs is one, and then there's some various chemical analyses that you find in people who have drowned, where there's discrepancies from normal in some of the chemical constituents in the blood. So she had all these issues. She had these kind of issues that show that she actually drowned. So we know that she drowned, and now the only question is, and then we also know that she had bruises on her arms and legs primarily, and a little bit on her cheek. So now, how did she get those bruises? Well, the first coroner said that she got those bruises because she tried to get into the boat and she couldn't get into. Let me back up a moment. She wound up into the water, but she was also with the next to it, the dinghy, the auxiliary boat, if you will.
Right.
The small boat. So she was trying to get into the boat, and she couldn't get into the boat. And anybody who's been in the water trying to get back into a rowboat can understand that it's not very easy to get back in the rowboat. And in the process, you can get a lot of, as you try to put your feet over the side, you get bruising. So a lot of these bruising were consistent with trying to get into the boat. Okay. The second coroner said, well, he couldn't make the distinction between some of the bruises as being while in the water, but other bruises could have happened on the boat, and therefore, he claimed undetermined. In my opinion, if her husband Robert Wagner, let's say, had an argument with her and pushed her, for example, by accident, and maybe he was drunk too, because everybody was drinking that night, then maybe she would have some bruises on her chest or on her back, and those were not mentioned in the autopsy report. And then besides that, if she accidentally fell into the water and because he pushed her, and but he didn't have intention to push her into the water or to kill her, then you would think that he would have tried to, jump into the water and find her or something like that. And there was no evidence of wet clothes or anything like that on the boat. So I don't know. To me, it seems unlikely that he had anything to do directly with it, although we know that they had an argument on the boat. But there's a lot of mystery. We can only go based on the evidence. And the evidence is that we know that she drowned because of the various biochemical and biological changes that were were found in the autopsy and toxicology report. And then as far as the matter of death, there are some questions, but basically there are no good answers. And so that's why it's undetermined.
And at this point, as time progresses, and I mean, obviously you have the three main survivors, Robert Wagner and the ship captain and Christopher Walken are all still alive. As that goes longer and longer, the chances of getting a solid answer to how it all went down are getting much harder, right? I mean, there's really nothing forensically, scientifically that'll be able to be brought out to prove if there's foul play afoot in this story.
Right, and these individuals who are still alive are not changing their story, and a lot of the written and forensic evidence has already been destroyed because time has passed. So that they haven't, the police department hasn't kept all that information. So by now, not only haven't they changed their story, they also say that anybody who disagrees that it was an accident, is not basing it on fact. So nobody changed their story, and the evidence, whatever there was, is not available anymore. So in that specific case, I think it'll be very difficult for the police to come up with a conviction when the evidence is not available anymore.
That's got to be frustrating for someone like you that wants the truth, is seeking the right answers. There's limitations to what can be done. Obviously, we've talked about the CSI effect on the show, where people watch TV, they see what happens, and in the course of an hour, maybe two on a special, CSI is able to crack the case and get the answers on even the smallest piece of forensic evidence, like a out-of-place thread or a tag from clothing. But that's not really the science of what goes into examining these type of cases. Does that impede your work as well because of the expectations? And does that bleed over into the expectations of the court itself, not just the lay people, but what the judges and prosecutors or defense attorneys think should be happening and at what rate?
The short answer is no. I like I said, for my work as an expert witness, I rely totally on the available facts. And I already mentioned them. And as far as the court is concerned, they're very methodical in terms of what they allow into the trial. So they don't hypotheses are not facts. Theories are not facts. For conspiracy theories are, as we all know, are theories, and theories are not facts. They're not based on facts. They're based on suppositions or basically public's thoughts about something, but they're not necessarily based on facts. If you can't prove it, then it's not admissible in court. And even in my case, when I testify, just to give you an example. I was in a case where it was an alcohol case, and there was a pedestrian who was crossing the street. She was at lunch. It was three ladies went to lunch. They had a few glasses of wine with their lunch, and then this one lady, she crossed the street, wound up in an accident. And there was alcohol in her system that was greater than 0.08. And so what I'm driving at is that in this case, alcohol was involved and was higher than the permissible amount for driving under the influence. And when I brought that up at the trial, as an example, when I quoted the amount of alcohol that she had, and then I just wanted to give it as an example that if you compare the amount that she had compared to 0.08, which is in drivers, as soon as I said that, the judge stopped me, because this was not 0.08 is for drivers, it's not for pedestrians. You see, so even though I only gave it as an example of the kind of influence alcohol can have at different alcohol concentrations, so that by 0.08 you can't even drive, because it affects your ability to think and to analyze. And I tried to give that as an example, but since this was not a driving case, the judge didn't even allow me to say that. So I think the the court is very concerned about allowing testimony that's not appropriate, and of course it's all subject to review in in appeals. So.
But in that case, though, Doctor, when you say if they can't be proved, it's not admissible, but isn't that the job of either side to share theories or concepts that would then cast a shadow of doubt on the case and give the jurors something else to consider besides the cut and dry aspect of the story that either side is presenting?
So, yes, so you want to give the information as well as you can, but within the guidelines. So, for example, I could say in her case, this pedestrian, I can say that she had an alcohol level, and then I can mention the number, and then I can also say, based on the scientific literature, what sort of effects that value in her blood will have. So it will make her, for example, not very attentive. She will not be able, she would generally tend to, and I showed how in her case, she kind of fit what we expected, that her value of alcohol in her blood, she, for example, just looked straight ahead when you're supposed to look both ways to make sure that there are no oncoming cars. This is a typical thing that you would tend to lose, the ability to consider looking both ways instead of just looking one way. If you have too much alcohol, also obviously having good judgment, having reaction time, all these things will be affected. So I can say all that, and I can say how at her level all these parameters were affected, but I can't relate that to driving.
Now, I'm curious in writing this book, and not just writing the book, but in examining these case files, what case do you feel was probably the most grossly mishandled by the time you were able to take a look at it, that the courts or science really seemed to drop the ball? But before we get into that, I do want to mention, folks, remember, you get the chance to listen to this program right here. If you'd like to hear the complete program with the Dumb Crime Stupid Criminals aspect, that is under the Stitcher Premium programming, so that you can subscribe to Stitcher Premium. That'll give you $5 a month, gives you all of the great shows Darkness Radio provides, plus True Crime Tuesday, and you get to listen to every other show under the Stitcher umbrella. Hundreds of thousands of entertaining hours from many different genres and milieus. So if you're interested, $5 a month will get you that premium content, all of Darkness Radio, all of True Crime Tuesday, commercial free. If you are fine with commercials and continuing to listen for free, then certainly continue to do so. We just wanted to give you the option to eliminate that aspect of these programs and to get the full True Crime Tuesday episode. Every week we will deliver the True Crime Tuesday interview in full, but to get the rest of the episode with Dumb Crime Stupid Criminals, you would need to be subscribed for the premium content. Again, you'll find that at Stitcher Premium. When signing up, use code word Darkness Radio, all one word, for deep discount savings on your first year of subscriptions. Again, go to Stitcher Premium and use code word Darkness Radio, all one word, for deep discount savings. If that one is expired, just use the word Darkness and you'll see what savings can be acquired through that. All right. We are here with our guest. We're speaking about his brand new book, Forensics, The Science Behind the Deaths of Famous People. Dr. Harry Milman, our guest. Dr. Milman, in examining a lot of these cases, what do you feel is the case that was probably most grossly mishandled, either by law enforcement, science, or technology?
So I have in this book, I reviewed 23 deaths of famous people. So as I mentioned, I'm an expert witness. I've published 2 novels with a forensic toxicologist as a main character. And then I was going to write another novel. It was going to be called Murder at the Taj Mahal. And I wrote about 30% of that book. And then there was news that Carrie Fisher, as we all know, she was the actress in Star Wars. She had a medical emergency aboard the plane. If you recall, she was flying back from London to Los Angeles, and then they labeled it the medical emergency. Basically, she slumped over on the shoulder of her assistant. She vomited. She started losing consciousness, and so they called it a medical emergency. They took it. They landed in Los Angeles, took it to the hospital. 3 days later, she died. Now. When I heard all that, I kind of followed those articles that were written at the time, and then I found out that when she died, they didn't do an autopsy. So, and primarily because the family refused to allow an autopsy to be done, and so when they didn't do an autopsy, that means they can't open up the body to look at anatomical changes, and they cannot take any blood or urine or hair samples or anything else for any sort of testing. And yet the coroner had to determine the cause of death. And so when I heard that, and then I heard that he concluded that she died from sleep apnea. Sleep apnea, for your listeners who may not know, is when you kind of stop breathing for a few seconds and then you start again. But a lot of people suffer from sleep apnea. The public didn't know that Carrie Fisher was suffering from sleep apnea. But we did know that she was a drug abuser. And so when I heard that the coroner said sleep apnea, I looked further into it because I was under the impression that most likely she died from a drug overdose, because we all knew that she was a drug addict. We knew that because she always mentioned it at the various speeches and conferences. So then I started looking at that. I dropped my novel, and I started looking at her autopsy, her situation. The records relate to her situation, and then from there I wound up looking at 22 others, and that's how the book came about. So here we are. We have Carrie Fisher having a medical emergency aboard the plane. They land in Los Angeles. At first, they thought she had a heart attack. Later, at the hospital, they decided she did not have a heart attack. And then 3 days later, they pulled the plug and she died. So now the coroner has to make a decision. What did she die from? He has to come up with cause of death and manner of death, and we already spoke about that. So, and the family refuses to give permission for an autopsy or toxicology testing. So now, and it's all in my book, the coroner is hampered in his ability to do his job, and so he cannot. Let's take the autopsy first. He cannot open up the body and look for anatomical changes. So instead, what they did was they did a CAT scan of the body. As we all know, a CAT scan is kind of like an X-ray. Looks at the internal organs. It's not as efficient as if you opened up the body and looked directly at, and took maybe tissue samples. But it's the next best thing. The CAT scan looked at the various internal organs, and they did not find anything unusual that would explain why she died. That is to say, there were no anatomical changes that were significant enough to have caused her death. Okay, so the next thing, what you normally do is you do testing of blood and urine. And again, he could not take any blood or urine because the family refused to give permission. So his next best thing was to get any blood or urine samples that were taken at the hospital. At the hospital, when you get admitted to the hospital, they usually take blood and maybe urine, primarily for treatment. So the doctors want to make sure that you're not on any, let's say, drugs that will interfere with their course of treatment. So so it's not done under police supervision or anything like that. So it's done for a different purpose. So so the coroner went to the hospital and asked them for whatever drug and urine sample was left, if any, after they used what they needed, after the hospital used what they needed. And of course, there wasn't that much left. And so that So the coroner, the forensic toxicologist, was able to test blood and urine that was taken at the hospital, which I should say was not at the time of death, because they took it at the hospital, when she had the medical emergency, which was 3 days before she died. And there wasn't that much left. And so therefore they could only do some tests, but not all the needed tests. Okay, so that was another way by which the coroner was hampered in his ability to do his job. He couldn't do an autopsy, and the toxicology testing was done on samples 3 days before she died, and also they couldn't do all the tests that were necessary. So what do I mean by that they couldn't do all the tests that were necessary? Well, the first round of tests usually is what they call a screening test. That's kind of a quick and dirty, if you will, test where you just look for the presence of certain drugs. Let's say drugs of abuse, usually like opioids or other central nervous system depressants. Those tests, that first screening test, is subject to false positives and false negatives. So if you find the presence, if that test gives you a positive, let's say for opioids, it doesn't necessarily identify which opioid. And not only that, the test could be a false positive. So, but that's a first inkling that maybe opioids are present in the blood, for example. So once you know that, then the next thing is you do a confirmatory test, which is very specific for opioids and also differentiates, so you can tell by the time you finish the test, you know which opioid and how much. So not only identifies, but also quantifies. And in order to know, for example, if there was an overdose, you need quantification of the drug in blood. So in this case, again, they got samples of blood that was taken 3 days before she died. And then they could only do the first test, but they couldn't do the second one. So it was subject to false negatives, false positives, and also they couldn't quantify. So they got some information, but not sufficient. So just to give you an idea, they did not find any alcohol, but they found as I mentioned, it can tell you that it has opioids. So they did identify the presence of opioid in the blood. They also found a metabolite of cocaine. They also found some presence of a couple of other pharmaceuticals that she had been taking, as well as an antihistamine in some of the other tissues. But they couldn't do the second test, the confirmatory and the quantification. So as I mentioned, they found opioid in the blood. They also found a metabolite of heroin in the vitreous humor of the eye. That means that's the gel behind the eye lens. So they found another metabolite of heroin in the gel behind the eye, which only tells you that it's there, the metabolite is there. It doesn't tell you how much, doesn't tell you when the heroin was taken, could have been a few days earlier. But seeing that metabolite of heroin, which is a second metabolite of heroin, strongly indicated that the metabolite that they found, the opioid that they found in the blood, most likely was morphine, which is the primary metabolite of heroin. Okay, again, this is not. They didn't measure morphine because it only indicated opioids, but it's a good scientific possibility, because you found the second metabolite of heroin, then the first one must have been morphine as well. But again, we don't know how much, and without knowing how much, you don't know if it was an overdose, and also it doesn't tell you when the heroin was consumed. And the same thing goes with the metabolite of cocaine. Again, we don't know when it was consumed. So there were a lot of missing questions here, missing answers. There were a lot of questions, but a lot of missing answers, primarily because the family refused to give permission for an autopsy to be done, and therefore couldn't do an autopsy, couldn't do proper testing, couldn't take samples at death.
Right.
Isn't
that strange, though? You figure, okay, she's under the care of an assistant. She's working with an assistant. Suddenly she, drops dead, basically, with this assistant. You would think that would at least predicate an opportunity to look into this to make sure that there was no foul play, nothing was slipped to Carrie while she was drinking or eating. And, did this person stand to gain anything from the death of Carrie Fisher?
Yeah, so we don't know why the family refused to give an autopsy. Like I said, it wasn't a suspicious death, so the police couldn't force them to do it. They refused. I suggested a couple of possibilities. One, that they didn't want to know, is one possibility. Another one is that they didn't want to tarnish her image, in terms of future earnings, is another possibility. There's also could have been a religious factor involved. Because Carrie Fisher came from, her father was Jewish, her stepfather was Jewish. She was married to Paul Simon, who was Jewish. So there's a lot of Jewish in the background by her own admission. And so, and according to the Jewish religion, autopsies are usually not permitted. So there's no way to know why the family refused for an autopsy. They certainly weren't required to have one. Non-celebrities, for example, normal deaths, a lot of times they don't have autopsies. So I have no idea. I gave these three possibilities why the family refused. But the bottom line is that the coroner was now unable to give a proper evaluation. So all in all, if we talk about cause of death, he had to give a cause of death. There was no way to say, undetermined, or I don't know, or she died because of, the heart stopped, or she stopped breathing. Those are not options. So he had to come up with an option. And since he couldn't blame drug use, because there wasn't enough information, and he saw no anatomical changes. Then he looked at the medical history and saw that she had sleep apnea, and she suffered sleep apnea episode on the plane. So he labeled the cause of death sleep apnea. But on manner of death, just like you pointed out, he couldn't identify whether it was an accident or otherwise, and so he labeled it undetermined. And that's basically the best he could do under the circumstances.
And I guess that's all that goes into these. I've got to wonder. Obviously, you're still a man of science. You have to look at the practicality of what's gone on, the report. But when we know it's a celebrity like Carrie Fisher, who's suffered with alcohol and drug abuse, how do you remove and kind of stick with the journalistic integrity and scientific integrity of not imposing the concept of, well, we all know she had drug problems. We all know, and kind of presupposing that over what's taken place, as opposed to the fact that she was overweight. She was, I think, 60. She's, although apnea, is, as you said, for a few seconds had to stop their breathing. They do know that increases the likelihood for strokes and heart attacks. That's why they treat sleep apnea so seriously. But is it harder, in all honesty, to kind of objectively remove yourself from what we know about celebrities from everything that's been posted and said, as opposed to what really took place?
Well, you have to resist that urge to do that because you can always say, for example, in her case, she had morphine metabolites, she had cocaine metabolites, she had other drugs in the system, and so you could theoretically say, well, she must have had a drug overdose, and that made her that in combination with a sleep apnea, caused her death, for example. that's conjecture. It's not based on facts. We just don't have enough information to make that leap. So you have to kind of resist that urge. And the public often does not do that. They don't resist. They just jump in. But as a scientist, you have to go with the facts, and based on the facts that were available, the best you can do is undetermined. As opposed, the alternative was to say, it couldn't have been a homicide because nobody. She was on the plane. Nobody gave her the drugs, killed her or whatever. It could have been an accident if she took too much on her own, too much drug, I should say. And there's no evidence that it was a suicide, that she tried to commit suicide. But a lot of questions, and so undetermined, I think, was appropriate in this case.
Now, let's examine something a little bit more nefarious. What about murder when it comes to celebrities? I know there's only a few of the cases that involved, homicide. When you're going into a case like that, walk us through, and if you don't mind picking one of the cases from the book to talk us through, and what it was like to re-examine that case file.
Well, I don't believe I have any cases on murder specifically. No, I'm looking at my list here.
I'm sorry. I thought from the PR it said that the drug use was implicated in about 70% of the deaths. 4 celebrity deaths were the result of suicide or homicide. 4 others were from natural causes that you had examined. I was going off of the press release information.
Right. Yeah, but there's no direct evidence of murder. Per se. But you're right. I think the main thing that surprised me in reviewing this is these cases is that we're talking about these celebrities as well as lay people. We're talking about adults who've been around for a while. They have certainly in celebrities they have the best medical care available. Lots of people, lots of advice, and yet, for whatever reason, a lot of them take several medications, and they take them, in therapeutic range. So any one pill, a sedative, for example, is in the therapeutic range. So it's not like, if you take a sedative, it's going to help you sleep, but it's not necessarily going to kill you. But certainly a lot of these celebrities, what happens is that we could take Michael Jackson, for example. Michael Jackson, we all know him as an entertainer, very energetic, great entertainer, dancing, singing, very upbeat. The man was 50 years old. He looks like 20. You think of him as 30, but in fact, he's 50 and he has the same issues that any other 50-year-old man has. And so on the night that so one of the issues that he has because of his occupation is that he couldn't sleep well because when you're performing, and especially if you have evening shows, by the time the show ends, in this case on his last night, he was in rehearsal and it ended about midnight, and you're very hyper, your adrenaline is pumping, and you cannot fall asleep very readily. And so he had his own physician who would prescribe for him sedatives. And what happens is you take one sedative, and maybe it helps you the first time, and then after a while you become tolerant to that dose. So maybe you increase the dose. Instead of one pill, you take 2, and then before you know it, you add a second pill, a different drug, and then some of these celebrities take 3 or 4 different pharmaceuticals, each one of them in the therapeutic range, but each one of them is a central nervous system depressant. And so when you're taking 3 or 5 different central nervous system depressants and you combine them, now you wind up in the overdose range for that effect. So, and that effect of central nervous system depressants like sedatives is respiratory depression, and then you stop breathing and then you die. So what do they die from? They don't die from an overdose of any given drug. They die from the combination of all the drugs that all have the same toxicological effect. And so they die from respiratory depression as a result of the combination of all these drugs, which we call polypharmacy. And what I was saying earlier, they have all this advice from lots of people and all these physicians, and of course they're all adults, and yet they don't recognize the fact that by taking all these drugs, and sometimes they also add on drugs of abuse like cocaine and heroin, and before you know it, that they take too much central nervous system depressants, each one of them appropriate, but combined puts you over the edge, and then you die from respiratory depression. In Michael Jackson's case, what I was referring to was, again, he couldn't sleep, so he got a sedative. On that specific night, he couldn't sleep. He got another sedative, got 3 or 4 different sedatives, and he still couldn't fall asleep. And so his physician gave him an intravenous infusion of propofol, which is an anesthetic medication that he has given him before. So it wasn't the first time, but it's a drug that's given, let's say, before surgery to put you, knock you out so you can have your surgery.
Right.
And in this case, he gave it to him at home, and not in a hospital environment. So he didn't have the proper equipment for resuscitation. And so now he had already given him several sedatives. He added now this propofol, which is a local anesthetic. Michael Jackson fell asleep. The doctor went next door, made a few phone calls, came back within a half an hour, and found Michael Jackson pretty much dead. And then he couldn't be resuscitated. And of course, he didn't have the equipment for resuscitation. And Michael Jackson was taken to the hospital, pronounced dead. So again, that was a combination of taking all these various medications. And of course, it was under doctor's supervision, no less, but it wasn't done in a hospital environment with the proper equipment.
When you look at a case, where suicide is involved, how quickly can you usually determine if it's suicide or a homicide being covered up as a suicide?
And by the way, I guess the Michael Jackson story probably fits into the homicide equation.
Right. Yeah.
As far as suicide, I'm sorry, you said suicide versus homicide. Well,
right. I was just curious of how quickly can we dismiss homicide from a suicide investigation as opposed to it being a murder that was then covered up to look like a suicide? Right.
So again, let's take one of the suicides that's in the book. That's Marilyn Monroe. We still talk about it today. So in Marilyn Monroe's case, she died from an overdose of sedatives. So many people today still believe that the CIA killed her, or maybe John F. Kennedy killed her, or his brother, Robert Kennedy. So again, there's a distinction between cause of death in her case versus manner of death. This cause of death, we know it was drug overdose because we saw the amount of drugs of these sedatives that were in her room. We found them in her blood in high concentrations. Definitely died from a drug overdose. How did the drug get into her system? Did she take him, or did somebody give it to her or forced it on her? Right? That would be homicide. Well, to start with, her room was locked. She was alone in the room. So, and the door was locked from the inside. So which tends to support suicide. Alone in the room, the door was locked from the inside. Then, besides that, how did she take the drugs? We know that she took them orally, and because we have the empty bottles on her nightstand, and she would have had to take many of them, and there's no evidence that she was forced fed. Also, there was no evidence in autopsy they looked for injection sites, some needle marks, but they looked at her body with a magnifying glass. They didn't find any. So take all that information together. She was alone in the room. She has done this before. Okay, tried to commit suicide by taking an overdose of drugs. She has done it before. The bottles were empty on her nightstand, and those drugs were in her system, which supported the idea that they were given, that she ingested them, and there's no evidence that somebody else gave them to her. So taking all that information together, plus they had all that evaluated by psychiatrists and toxicologists, and so the conclusion was it was definitely a suicide. So obviously, if there's any question, it would be undetermined. But in her case, there was no question, so it was suicide.
Forensics, the science behind the deaths of famous people. Dr. Harry Milman, our guest today. Dr. Milman, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your unique perspectives and expertise in examining this. It's interesting to get to hear that different side of, investigative techniques. So we appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
It's been a pleasure. The book is in our links today, as well as Dr. Milman's website, so you can find both there. For those of you that are subscribed to the Stitcher Premium podcast, you're going to get to hear Dumb Crimes, Stupid Criminals. For those of you that are not, thank you for tuning in and spending your time with us here. We'll be back again next week with more of the best in true crime talk radio. We hope you enjoyed today's program of True Crime Tuesday. And remember, if you'd like the full episode with the Dumb Crimes, Stupid Criminals aspect, all you have to do is go over and subscribe now for Stitcher Premium. Use code word Darkness Radio, all one word, to get some deep discount savings for your 1-year subscription. And it will give you access to all of our archives from Darkness Radio. There's over 1,000 episodes up and available, and more being added constantly. You get all of the episodes of True Crime Tuesday, and you get all of the other great programs that are part of Stitcher. Hundreds of thousands of hours of programming for $5 a month, commercial free. You can't beat that, so don't even try. Go subscribe now, and remember to use keyword Darkness Radio for those key savings.